core of why we're here today is to talk about the link between creativity and entrepreneurship. And so we're going to ask ourselves as a group, like, what's the connection between the two? We have a theory that we present to you. And what separates a great idea from a successful business venture? And I think this is probably why most of us are here, is to talk about that part of it, is how do we move from what we think of as the light bulb idea and into making it something that people want.
And so we've spent a lot of time studying and thinking about the creative process, and we've come to the conclusion that actually the creative journey and the entrepreneurial journey are one and the same. They map onto each other really beautifully. So we're going to kind of walk you through why that is and how you can incorporate different types of creative thinking into your entrepreneurial process. So if you think about it, both creativity and entrepreneurship center around innovation. So what does that mean? Bringing new ideas and solutions into being, into the world. So prevailing definitions of creativity tend to focus on two things: novelty and usefulness. So it's something that hasn't been done before, it's new, but it also needs to be useful. It can't just be some crazy far-fetched idea that has no real-world application. And so that really applies to the entrepreneurial process. You're launching a venture that's trying to bring something new into the world, but it also has to apply to some real-world problem.
Some of you may know the term use case in the entrepreneurial process. This is what we're talking about, is that usefulness in the parlance of the, I guess I don't want to say, in the entrepreneurial world, it's use case. Does the world need what you want to put into it?
So when we think about the creative process, there's kind of two different types of thinking that are involved. There's divergent thinking and convergent thinking. Has anyone heard these terms before? Okay, a little bit. So divergent thinking is what we often tend to think of as creativity. It's making new connections between things. It's associative thinking. It's what we might kind of in general parlance refer to as right brain thinking, although that's kind of a misnomer because contemporary neuroscience is really showing us that creativity is a very distributed process in the brain that can't be localized to any one area. So we talk about right and left brain thinking, and it has some usefulness, but it's not completely accurate. So an example of divergent thinking, what's the first word that comes to your mind when I say umbrella? Anybody?
Rain.
Rain.
Cover.
Cover. What else? First thought.
Bumbershoot.
Bumbershoot.
Fussy.
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 Color.
Color.
Singing.
Singing.
In the rain.
Great.
Yeah, yelling rubber babes, yeah.
So this is an example of divergent thinking. It's making associations between things. So a lot of typical kind of creativity tests will ask you to think of as many things you can come up with to do with a brick in 1 minute. And it's just about coming up with ideas. So brainstorming really follows this process. It's really opening up, opening out, asking the what if question. What's possible, okay? So that's the one side, but we also need convergent thinking, which is the more linear, the more rational, logical. It's the to-do list, it's making an outline, it's figuring out what are the necessary steps to get from A to Z. It's very practical. But to bring, if you think about it, any creative project or any venture to fruition, you have to have both. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how they fit together. It's a very kind of cyclical, iterative process.
And I also add that most of us think we know what we mean when someone says brainstorming, but to truly brainstorm means to let yourself expand without judgment. Many of us move into convergent thinking, oh, that's not going to work, that's not going to work, too soon. So a true brainstorm is very expansive, and it should have an element of the ridiculous in it, so that you can actually kind of find your true north about what is possible while you're diverging. And I think that sometimes we get focused on bottom lines or how are we gonna make this happen, so we will sometimes shortcut the divergent thinking, and that's really not a gift. It's shortcutting your process.
So we have a few traditional models of the creative process that have been brought forth through the years. And the first was by Graham Wallace in 1926. He was one of the first to really put his mind toward this creative process. And interestingly enough, Wallace was an English social psychologist. He was a socialist. And he was also one of the original co-founders of the London School of Economics. So really bringing creativity and finance and business together from this early of a time.
So if you can, this makes it seem linear, but it's not, we're not suggesting that it's linear. But first stage is preparation. In many ways this is convergent. You're doing research, you're finding out what's out there. Have other people explored this? Is that domain name already taken? So it says here, building your knowledge base. Incubation is more the divergent thinking, and it's moving into the what ifs, what's possible about your idea. The other part that I think is probably under-discussed and misunderstood is how important it is at this point to let intuition have a role. So you study, you do your research, and we'll talk more about this, but then you also have to let go. And it's often, when you're doing something that's not directly convergent, like what's the answer, it's when you're taking a shower, or you're driving in the car, or you're going for a walk, is that this incubation period will sometimes give you an answer.
Because, and I want to say one thing about that. So sometimes when we step away from a project, our mind is still working on it behind the scenes. It may not be in the forefront of our conscious mind, but so many great scientific insights have been derived when the person was sleeping, and they had a dream of this mathematical equation, or, so you're sitting at the computer, you're coding all night, and then at some point there's a point of diminishing returns, right? And you have to get up and walk away. But that doesn't mean that you're not, that you're distracted or that it's not worthwhile, because sometimes at those very moments when you're out in the world doing something completely different, that the insights actually arise.
And I'll say this as a teacher and a writing coach is, I feel very strongly about this, that a lot of times people will walk away from a divergent phase with a sense of defeat. I don't have the answers right now, I don't have the resources. But it's actually part of the natural rhythm of the process that you need to take that break. So I would encourage you not to be defeatist, but to understand you're in a rhythm. And often, as Melinda said, this leads to the aha moment. And then verification gets us back to use case. What does the real world need, the answer that you've come up with? There's another model we'd like to take a look at is the lean startup model.
So you may be familiar with this handy book here, the Lean Start. Anybody heard of this? Yeah, okay. So interesting, this is just one depiction of the model. There are different ways to visualize it. But what we like about this one is that it shows that it's not a linear process. It's very cyclical. You start out with a need, you do your research and observation, you brainstorm, you come up with a hypothesis, you experiment, you build something, you refine it, you test it out. And then once you've tested it out, you're always continuing that rapid prototyping, that refining, and then actually bringing it out to market into the world.
And I think that so iterative and rapid prototyping, those two go hand in hand, where you're trying to find out if what you have in your head or your team's head is actually translating into something that people need. And that's one of the things that we've read, is that the people tend to not spend enough time on rapid prototyping, and that means just putting something out there to see if people want what you have, or what you've got in your head is translated in clearly. And so that you're gonna spend time here, so you've converged, and then you're gonna need to diverge, and then you're gonna converge, and so it's kind of messy, but it's helpful for you to know that you're in a place, oh, I need to switch the kind of thinking that I'm using right now. If I'm too focused on converging, I might be too tight, and I might need to open up a little bit to move into divergent thinking to see how people are taking in my ideas and how I can answer it if I'm not delivering on what I think I'm delivering on.
Great. So we at Syncreate have come up with our own model and kind of a simple image here that actually Drew Carpenter, our graphic designer and business partner there in the back, has created.
So there's a couple cool things about this. One, we like it because it's streamlined. We also like it because Drew made it, but also that there's circles within circles. So really showing that there's a process happening here. And the thing that I'm really excited about is this idea of play. That play is one of your best assets when you're in this process. And we're going to do some of that in a minute. But that you are able to move into what we would think of as child's mind. Children have an expansive, out-of-the-box way of approaching things that often our adult mind will shortcut. And so can we move into a child's way of thinking about things? Or is it with a sense of play, with our own process? I do this as a writer in my own books. I do crazy what-ifs to find the true what-ifs. It makes me take myself a little less seriously. And I think that that's an asset when you're trying to solve real-world problems.
So play in this model is kind of that space for the divergent thinking, whereas plan and produce are more convergent, but you see how they all really flow and work together. They can't really be separated. So we're going to go into an exercise